Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also visit us at patreon.com/The Bitter Truth, and you can become a bitter pill and get some freshly toasted stickers for your toolbox or your car or what have you. Today we've got, I'm excited, we have in studio a friend of the show, activist, has been around the world, literally, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Venezuela, name it. He's worked with the Green Party the last presidential campaign as a field director. Very, very well versed in foreign affairs and domestic affairs, and none other than Adrian Boutureira, and I'm glad to have him on the show again. How are you, man?
Well, very well, thank you, Abe. Always so kind with your introductions.
Well, you did the stuff, I didn't. So
yeah.
If I did it, I'd get a tattoo.
I might take you up on that.
So yeah, man. So big stuff this week. So obviously, you know, I had a discussion with a good friend of mine this afternoon. We were talking about France and everything. She wasn't really following it, and I was saying, I bet we have a France by this summer. And adorably, she said, "Well, people never learn. Nothing's going to happen." I go, "Have you followed what's been happening in France?" She goes, "Well, no, I'd kind of been off of that for a while. I haven't followed France in about a year." Right. So I gave her a little bit of a rundown of what's been going on with the yellow vests. But let's jump into it. They've actually gotten some results, right? Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's one of these phenomena where you have these grassroots movements that begin to develop and seem to organically arise out of a set of pending grievances that a given society has, right? Mm-hmm. In some ways, you know, no different than Occupy, and inheriting some of the same merits as well as some of the same limitations. I believe that the very nature of the movement as a primarily decentralized movement has given it its flexibility as well as some of its handicap. Right. You know, we have been measuring the week by week sort of appearances of the mobilization numbers, right? And they have been steadily declining. And one has to ask why that is. And again, from the way I am watching this, and from my position at least, I feel that the movement has embraced this set of grievances, and in different sectors of the movement, you see different manifestations of it. Some are outright almost libertarian, right-wing leaning. Mm-hmm. I've seen several different sets of demands that have been produced. Mm-hmm. Since there is no centralized structure organizing these things, you know, you have a multiplicity of these declarations, manifestos that are coming from the grassroots up. And when you look at some of them, they're clearly being produced and written as very defined leftist demands. Right. You know, in other words, let me give you an example. In the case of immigration, I've seen some statements in terms of demands from the government, of the government, where they're saying, hey, we cannot absorb any immigrants that we cannot accommodate. Mm. In other words, like where I've seen others that are clearly much more thought out and said, like, when it comes to immigration, we need to examine the root causes, and we need to examine what role has France played. Mm-hmm. As a historic colonial power, but not just only as a historical colonial power, recently. but as part of global capitalism and in cahoots with Western imperialism. Absolutely. So you look at the role of France in the devastation of Libya, mm-hmm. and then you begin to understand why there may be so many Libyans, particularly from southern Libya, that are desperate to get out when we have regressed to a position where black Libyans are treated like almost like there's like a slave trade in Libya.
It is a I mean, they're selling Yemenis for $400 a pop.
Exactly.
And then this spring, Sarkozy is on trial for taking $50 million from Gaddafi in 2007 for his campaign. And last spring, he tried to get it thrown out of court, and they said, "No, you're going to trial." But in this fall, actually, they said this spring he's on trial for that.
Yeah.
campaign finance. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And so
I'm trying to understand the phenomenon here, not being in France. And I'm kind of trying to identify some of these patterns because, my fear has always been, and, my roots are anarcho-syndicalist. I'm very fearsome of hugely centralized operations, which can very easily lead to a stratification of power relations between leadership and the mass. Having said that, as I've grown older, I've begun to realize that effective revolutions and effective movements have being guided by a form of organized, centralized structure with a unified set of principles and with a unified agenda and with a unified strategic process. I don't think there is a unified strategy for the Yellow Vests right now.
No, there isn't.
So some demands were met.
Right. Quite a few.
And that took out a huge sector.
Right.
Of the resistance or of the movement, which were appeased by that,
right?
And so whereas institutionally speaking, it's not as if private banking, is no longer has the government of France by the balls, right? It's not as if the government of France is all of a sudden not answering, to the interest of private capital in order to serve the people,
right?
So without a unified guiding, organizing, strategic plan.
Right.
Usually under the leadership of a party or under a very clear, unified social movement.
Right.
As was the case with the indigenous peoples movement in Ecuador or even Bolivia.
Right.
Which eventually, led to the leadership of Evo Morales. Right.
Right.
So we have that to contend with. Again, a lot of the demands were met, but ultimately, much more so than what the Occupy movement achieved here.
Right.
But yet, I believe that it fell short of what I believe the more radical momentum at its peak could have provided.
Well, they're ramping back up in January. I just saw a little news clip. I forgot what side it was on, but they're ramping back up in January. And to the listener who doesn't know what the strikes were about, because unfortunately, I'll still watch CNN or MSDNC because I got to do my homework, and they keep making it about this 25-cent a gallon tax, that was supposed to go to green resources, and then they paint Macron as this guy, poor guy, he's trying to do green, and those ungrateful French people,
Right, yeah.
frog bastards, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
So when you look at what happened, he did a tax cut for the rich, not unlike we did. Mm-hmm. And then he was going to balance the budget by cutting pensions, raising the pension tax, making people pay for health care, making people pay for college, then sell off airports and ports and other utilities, not unlike Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, privatizing.
Yeah, where it's like, it's like a crackhead going to the pawn store. How many more things can you pawn off before you're just completely out of things to sell?
Right, which is the neoliberal model of the whole European Union, which is what happened with the debt in Greece.
Right.
In other words, it's not as if the European Union stood up against, private banking and banking speculation. They basically assumed the debt.
Right.
So you change, you just change who Greece owes money to.
Right.
Whereas, that was a golden opportunity for the European Union to say, we assume this as a community.
Right.
And we will, provide whatever funding, if the United States can print money to get itself out of whatever. So then the Europeans could also be playing with their own currency.
Right.
But so there is that model that is being followed, which I believe is beginning to dawn on a lot of the problem is that within Europe, and this is what worries me a little bit, you are witnessing manifestations of right-wing nationalism, that become undercurrents for what are ultimately grievances that the people have against neoliberal capitalism.
But isn't that always a response to a neoliberal failure. I mean, when you look at the last marriage of corporations and government, it was the Nazi Party.
Yeah, the fascists in Italy.
Yeah, and fascists in Italy. I hate to bring that up because that's such a word. Like people right now probably white noise in their head when I said that. But the fact is that historically, the fascists in Italy and Germany were the last marriage of religion, corporation, the press, and the government.
Right.
Where it was all one big party.
Right.
And so that came out of the failure of the neolibs, if you want to call them that, in the 20s in the Weimar Republic, where they basically created austerity, socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
Right.
Like we have here. And I honestly think that we're going to have France by summer. I'm optimistic. And some people, oh my God, I'm worried I hope that doesn't happen. I'm like, I hope that does happen.
You think what?
I think we'll have a France by summer. I'm hoping.
Yeah?
I'm hoping. Because if you look at, I was watching something online the other night, and there was 2,000 protests in France. People don't understand this. It wasn't like a couple of guys in Paris couldn't get a baguette, right? It was 2,000 protests with 300,000 citizens. And this guy overlapped the map of Texas over the map, and it was just a little bit bigger than France. Could you imagine if Texas had 2,000 protests?
Right, yeah.
Texas alone would get the attention of the country.
Right.
If it was half of California or a third of Florida, if Flint, Michigan were to protest like that.
Right. No doubt. But I mean,
and not an Occupy, not I'm sorry, but not Occupy movement where that was a really nice sit-in, very polite. They stayed in the park.
But we have an example that is a little bit closer to what happened or what is happening in France, which was, the reaction of people in Greece. In other words, I was convinced that Greece was going to turn, the direction, and ultimately the process got co-opted. The emerging People's Party, Syriza, completely capitulated and compromised, and it fizzled.
Right.
The challenge for organized resistance, in my opinion, at a global level, but particularly in Eastern Europe and the United States, is how to keep these mass movements that are emerging out of legitimate grievances that mostly the working class of those countries have, either through the internal policies of the country or a combination of internal policies, and in the case of Europe, policies of the European Union, et cetera, in relation to how do you keep these vibrant emerging movements from being co-opted or from fizzling. Now, I think you brought up a good point, Abe. We should probably talk about what are some of the primary grievances that the French people, are jointly proclaiming and going to the streets, for. There is a huge pressure on privatization of the public sector. There are huge pressures on taxation that are being increased, for the working class, while very few, while the taxation for the rich are being reduced. That was one of the formulas that were supposed to be implemented in Greece. Greece is notoriously void of any true tax enforcement of the wealthy.
Right.
But what is the problem? It cannot be a single country solution in the European Union model, because if you're a Greek investor, if you're and I want to tax your wealth in Greece in order to instead of implementing the austerity measures, that basically punished collective punishment of the Greek working class for the bad policies of corrupt governments. The solution was go ahead and increase the taxation of the rich and create a proper tax system. Well, what if you do that in Greece alone, you just take your money to a French bank, to a German bank. As a citizen of the European Union, there are hundreds of loopholes.
Absolutely.
And so this, what happened in Greece, did not necessarily meet with the support of the organized working class movements of the rest of Europe. Lo and behold, Syriza fizzled away, and there they are, capitulating and implementing austerity programs that and privatized just like you said.
Sure. Well, and see,
privatized the ports.
Yeah.
Sold out all the assets, anything that had to do with government assets. So basically,
we've got a ton of American towns here that are doing that. They're selling off their parking meters. They're selling off their sewage systems. They're selling out some of them are selling off parts of their airports. I mean, like Scranton, Pennsylvania is a great example. They raised, I think, $10 million, $15 million inside of about 6 months. But then, utilities went up by 30%, parking went up. I mean, because now it's in the hands of privatization.
Yeah.
But why do you think? And I'm asking this rhetorically because you're the expert, so I'm not going to talk to myself. Why do you think it's so easy to get the so-called middle classes to have it baked into the brain that to vote against their own interests? Right. Yeah. So, for example, if the tax cuts on the wealthy, for example, to them it's not a lot of money what they are going to save. But as Roosevelt wrote to his brother when the letters were published after he passed away, I saved capitalism, because he walked right into revolt. He walked right into riots, labor union strikes going very bad, people dying. Yeah. World War I vets getting their bonuses not paid to them 7-8 years later, and now they're in the middle of a depression 10 years later. Now I want my bonus. They're at the steps of the Capitol demanding their bonus. So Roosevelt openly said he saved capitalism. And so yet you talk to the average middle-class guy in this country, and in Europe too, I think they believe this. Well, one day I can be rich. I don't want to be taxed like that. It's like, well, wouldn't you rather give a little bit to keep? I mean, the tax rate in France right now is between 14 and 45%. Okay?
All right.
With free healthcare, free education, a robust pension, that's called an investment. I would gladly pay more tax to get all that.
Yeah.
I pay about 25% right now when I had a W-2 job. And now that I'm back to 1099, pay a little less, but I still pay taxes. I'm not getting all that. And I'm still paying for Medicare that I don't get till I'm 65. So what is it about the psyche that just allows this to run rampant? And people, just like you said a second ago when you said, a lot of the yellow vests, they got some of their pet things, right, and now they're out, right? And then you get the true believers are going to stay until they get everything. No, you're not going to sell the airport. No, you're not going to sell the ports. But what is it about that psyche that just allows this to go, and then they accept that as a fact?
Well, I mean, it's a combination of things. Of course, I don't think that there is one single reason. A lot of it has to do with where we've gone in terms of political education and class awareness. I think that there's been through the affluence and the prosperity after World War II, where I think that it became quite easy for the middle class to begin to identify with this impression of prosperity and wealth that could perhaps lead to that transformation of lower middle class or middle class to actually the top aristocracy of at the top of the economic of the ladder. I believe that you have clearly in the United States, at least, much more surprisingly in Europe, where there is a history of class consciousness and awareness, but there is also like a systemic affront and attack on the public institutions and on public services that begin to sort of make people feel, well, it's not working. So you undermine the public schools, you undermine the public hospitals, you underfund them, you don't support them, you make sure that you discredit the public sector, so that people it's like let the corporations run it, and privatization becomes therefore a perceived solution to the demise of the public sector. But we know that's not accidental. In other words, you can have a functional public sector.
Right.
Simultaneously, there's been a shift as well in terms of what guides the principles of society. The debt culture. We live. In other words, we've gone from private debt to public debt. And that public debt, plays a huge impact on how people perceive their relationship to the state, the role of private banking, and so the discredit of the state in general, I think, fuels this idea that you're better off with a rampant capitalist system but obviously it doesn't work.
It fails every 4 to 7 years.
Yes, I mean the cycles of deregulation. When banking was regulated, from 1945, from right after the war until 1970, there were no crises.
Right.
In 1970, when the whole deregulation system came into play, when Nixon, eliminated the gold
standard,
standard,
right.
Then you start to see that from that moment on,
right.
So you basically shift,
right.
From a society that's being controlled by industry and productivity to a society that's being controlled by finance and debt.
Right.
Right. And so people are transitioning in and out of that depending on the wealth of their own nations. And I believe that the erosion of the public sector is contributing to that. But in this country, we've never really had a real identification of, people don't see themselves as members of the working class. Everybody here is middle class. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're in debt, for everything they own is it's borrowed, and yet, like you said, they continue to identify, with the interest of their, of their finance masters, right?
Well, it's no different than when this country was first getting started, when we were bringing slaves over, and the founding fathers, whatever you want to call them, the elites, the guys that wrote the Constitution and everything else, and they saw, not unlike in the early 70s when a lot of the Black Panthers were starting to hang out with a lot of white nationalists, going, "Hey, we're getting fucked." Right. Yeah, we are getting fucked, and they shot a couple of those guys, kind of end that movement. But what the elites saw was, well, the serfs who were getting treated not too much different than the slaves. Pretty much beat the same way and everything else, but at least they were getting paid a little something. But they were not in that class, could not own any property. So how can the elites keep the majority of the whites on their side? Oh, hey, you're not those guys.
Right. Making
blacks subservient, making them inferior in the eyes of these poor white people. So they thought, oh, well, I can aspire to be that one day.
Right.
Right. And so that's no different than what we're doing now.
Right.
And we haven't really ever had, I don't think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've ever had, for long expanses of time, beyond Roosevelt, which that's even questionable, a real liberal agenda. And when I say liberal, I don't mean this corporate Hillary Clinton shit. I'm talking about a true progressive agenda, like a Henry Wallace,
right? Yeah.
Like kind of a thing. It just seems like we've co-opted the church, the colleges, the press, which used to be the fourth estate, right? And so where do we go moving forward? Because every time you talk to somebody like a conservative, for example, and then you bring something like this up, they point to some failed system. They don't even point to any of the successful European models. They keep saying, well, look at Venezuela. Well, look how much we fucked with Venezuela. That doesn't count.
Right.
Right? So what kind of language do you think we need to start adopting to make a point that's cogent? I notice when I take certain skunk words out of my conversation.
There are several. The commons, understanding what constitutes the commons, understanding the value of public institutions, understanding the democratizing power of functional public institutions as a check and balances of power, understanding how a proper government functioning in protection of the interest of the people is better serves the people through strict regulations of institutions that are created for profit and for the profit of because Europe in some ways is no different. We have, we often talk about the 1%. Okay, so the 1% controls 25% of the wealth, but 20% controls 65% of the wealth. Yet people are still identifying with that 21% of the population, with that 20% of the population, when we are actually and we made that mistake sometimes when we, in other words, we have to be very, very keen on when we speak about economic tiers and what wealth is owned by what. I believe that, for instance, Occupy made a mistake by harping on we are the 99%. It's like, no, we're not the 99%, because just like you said, you have not just the top 20% of the country owning almost like 75% of the wealth. Okay, so you break it down into quintiles. Okay, so that the top 2 quintiles own more than 75% of the wealth in this country, and those people are directly associating and defending the mechanisms of protecting wealth, protecting the wealth of the oligarchy, protecting the wealth, and so we have to be very clear with how we facilitate the identification of working class America with working class interests,
right?
In a way that does not necessarily have to degenerate into sort of useless rhetoric.
Right.
It's very simple.
Sure.
The government and not private corporations government is supposed to serve the interest of the people. And if the government is no longer doing that, the solution is not to basically turn the government into a corporatocracy,
right,
at the service of corporations and at the service of the elite, but to actually, force the government through social organizing and through hopefully a viable political force.
Absolutely.
So I believe that the incorporation and the revitalizing of the construct of the commons, the idea that there were corporate charters that were in place, even in the United States, that created, specific, guidelines for how a corporation should even exist.
Right.
Making sure that finance institutions are highly regulated, eliminating public debt, and definitely public debt to private institutions, and then making the government and the taxpayer assume the debt of banking institutions that we have deregulated. For this corporations and these banking institutions deemed as like too big to fail.
Right.
It's a win-win. You can gamble. You can get into the darkest possible financial schemes, and because you have been deemed as too big to fail,
right,
like when you fail, you will pass your mistakes.
Right.
I mean, in what world does that,
socialism for the rich and socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor?
Yeah, but explaining that alone, I mean, I don't think people understand how that has worked. Everybody talks about how corporations were bailed out.
Right.
They were not just bailed out.
Yeah.
In other words, we transfer the debt,
the mistakes
and the debt of these institutions.
That's right.
Because in reality, like they have wedded, they have abandoned, okay, the fate of the average working class person to the profiteering manipulations of these multinational corporations that have time and time again shown that they are not true to nation or God. I mean, there is nothing except that when they need to, they will wave that flag. And then when you have somebody like Trump in the White House, in other words, I mean, not that Obama was not a pawn,
warmonger.
Prick, I mean, he was also in the pocket of we know, because he was the one who bailed out.
Well, in the last recovery, just a really quick side note, before 2008, before the crash in 2008, from the Depression on, any recession that we had obviously the Depression, but any recession that we've had since, 70% of Americans would participate in the recovery. okay, 70% of Americans would participate in the recovery, meaning, jobs came back, real jobs, not Walmart, but like real jobs came back, raises. From '08 on, only 1% of the population participated in the recovery. So what does that tell you?
Right.
And then the other part, really quick, is, I want to talk about some other stuff too, but I honestly think if we've given you any money ever, then we own you. You send the government accounting office to referee a co-op where the workers are able now to fire and hire, because there's no reason. The Costco, I saw an interview, a friend of mine sent me a YouTube clip, the Costco CEO. He makes 10 times the amount of the lowest paid worker there. Excuse me. And he's got a really nice salary. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the lowest paid worker or the lowest paid executive. His salary is like $2 million to run Costco. Right? And they're profitable.
Yeah.
And they're trading high. Meanwhile, the head of GM makes $22 million. They just shipped out 15,000 jobs. We give them money, which, they paid back some of it. But if we gave you money at all, if you're in a position where we have to bail you out and we now own you.
No, nationalizing those industries.
The banks, I say nationalize the banks.
But the structures for nationalization have been completely eradicated. In other words,
it's not Teddy Roosevelt anymore.
No, I mean, not even then. So I mean, you would need a radical shift in how we perceive government, and that as much shit as this right-wing talking heads will talk against, they will never, support, going for the throat of the oligarchy infrastructure and replacing it. Because, of course, like you said, the introduction of, this is communism, this is socialism. Sure. It's like, I don't give a shit what it is. In other words, like, there is no way that you're going to use my tax dollars to continue to bail out corporations that then put a whole generation in debt.
See, but here's the thing, and this is where I think we have fallen into a malaise since Bill Clinton. We have fallen into this thing where we keep waiting for the government to do for us. And I heard this joke once, and it's 100% true, I believe. Nixon was the last liberal president we had. And not because he was a nice guy, not because he believed in liberal policies, but because he was afraid of the liberal class. He was afraid of Ralph Nader, which is why we got seatbelts, which is why we have OSHA, which is why we had Title IX. We got the Cancer Act. We got HMO. I mean, he put his thumbs in the eyes of his base when he passed that stuff. Mm-hmm. So, and why? Because he was a good guy? No, because he was afraid of an opposition party.
Right.
Women got the right to vote. Opposition party. FDR gave in to the labor unions and Social Security and because of opposition, not because of anything else.
No, to save, in other words, this is just sort of like strategic, survival for capitalism, right? And interestingly enough, though, I wanted to, before I forgot, now about debt, which is critical. The recovery of Germany, one of the things that happened that led to the miracle of recovery in Germany after the war
and Japan
was debt forgiveness.
Right, we did that to Japan too.
Debt
under the Marshall Plan.
No debt.
Right.
So the Germans owe pretty much the success of their economic sort of stability today to that. Yet, they went for the throat of the Greek people over their debt.
Right.
So we're not going, you know what I mean? Because Germany was key in blocking any possible debt forgiveness for Greece or any kind of assumption of that debt, collectively by the European Union to counteract, the whole idea that private institutions could again hold a European Union country in check.
Right.
Now. I do think that having the ability to recognize the importance of what is the cost of debt, who controls that debt, what is the impact that is having on you as a family, on your children, the student debt, So I think that for the most part, in my experience, we are moving towards the awakening in a lot of people that these things are not evil. These things are not part of some, Russian, because some people people are still thinking of Russia and communism as one. It's ridiculous, right?
They still see communism. It's just been dead for 30 years.
I know.
That's just been dead for 30 years. They said to me with a straight face, like, are you kidding? And you went to college. You're my age. If a freshman at UT is watching Rachel Maddow, whatever. Okay, I understand. You're 19. That's adorable. My friend's kids, fine. But you're my age, and you don't remember when they chopped down the wall, and they had elections, and they got a McDonald's in Moscow now. It's like she's just been dead for a while.
Yeah, no idea. I mean, and the fact that communism in Russia is having somewhat of a comeback in certain regions, and yet there is still a lot of repression, against any possible resurgence of communism. But
sure.
I think it's critical. I mean, the point that you raised, because we have to move towards practical solutions. Mm-hmm. We can speak rhetorically and identify a lot of. Now, the key thing and my greatest worry is, how do we prevent? Because the conditions are so similar, Abe.
Yeah.
In terms of it's about to pop again. I mean, this is the worst December that Wall Street had seen ever, I think.
Yeah.
There are, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
All serious economists are predicting that this level of speculative lending and borrowing and just fueling.
It's casino capitalism. It doesn't produce anything.
Right. I mean, instead of investing, instead of having already begun the transition towards a green economy, the whole, Green New Deal that Jill and the Green Party promoted during the last election, and now Ocasio has been promoting. But of course,
she's co-opted.
But she's already. But I mean, even her co-opted version has been knocked down,
right,
by the Democratic Party status quo. I mean, in other words, people are focusing a lot on she's co-opting, she's basically like a sheepdog for the Democratic Party, co-opting radical ideas. I don't think that's intentional. I think that it's
intentional on the part of the Democratic Party,
and part of the Democratic Party, and of course, her and Bernie and everybody who's thinking that transformation is going to come through the Democratic Party, continue to repeat this mistake.
I got a better chance of growing hair before the Democratic Party transforms into anything resembling its former self.
I don't know what former self is that. I mean,
at least under FDR. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but at least it was something.
Well, because he was forced to. In other words, it's not as if that the Democratic. I mean, he basically, had to perhaps.
He had to respond to demand.
Yeah, I mean, there was.
And here there
was no way to avoid a major, collapse of capitalism unless they implemented Keynesian economics and
sure.
and basically
take for example the bailout in 2008.
Right.
People overwhelmingly called Congress, demanding to not vote for the bailouts. And Congress went behind a back room because the first vote didn't go the way they wanted. They voted on it again. And then they said, well, fuck you guys. Sorry, we're going to do it this way because their corporate donors told them to.
Right.
So I'm talking. It has to be from demand. And if we have to have France this summer where we've got, say, 10, 15, 20,000 in a country this size, it's enough to scare the shit out of people. Right. I mean, if John Boehner can come around to the idea of marijuana, maybe I can get a business owner, conservative as he is, sleeps praying to Jesus every night. If he has 60 people in his business, he's paying $2 million a year for health insurance.
Oh yeah.
This is 2 plus 2.
Right.
This is not magical.
Right.
If I go to said business owner, he's not going to care if I'm an atheist, communist, homosexual. He didn't give a shit. If I say, hey, listen, man, if I cut $2 million out of your bottom line, and now your employee is not paying $900 for his contribution. Right. And you're not paying $2 million. By the way, we don't have healthcare. We have forced insurance.
Yeah.
I got a good friend of mine last month was $325,000. Her insurance company rescinded their payments from March of 17 of last year.
Oh no,
so now she's looking at $325,000 of bills she thought were taken care of.
Abe, it's chronic. I mean, it is insidious.
Yeah.
It's corporate welfare at its worst.
Yeah.
I mean, at least they eliminated the penalty, but again the inherent failure of Obamacare was not actually making it universal. Single payer, universal health care. Simple. It has, they created a situation where, for anyone who has had the displeasure of having to go through the marketplace and you're at the mercy of it's completely deregulated.
That's right.
They can charge an increase, by whatever percentage they want. And people are forced to buy insurance. No longer. Which I don't know how I feel about that because, we don't particularly want millions of people uninsured, and landing in public hospitals. In other words, it's like it's this vicious cycle that is created by the cowardness of government in not assuming its responsibility to take care of its population and the master job that they've done on people's heads to think that these things are not the business of government when that's exactly what governments are created for. And if if you cannot wrap your brain around how the average American I just don't understand it. You got to have your head up your ass so far.
Absolutely.
That you're living paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
Your SUV or whatever it is, you put you're up to your neck in debt.
That's right.
Your children are going to college and they're in debt. Every single day that you wake up, you have corporate America at your throat, making your life miserable. Even when you are living in your, $300,000 or $400,000 home, everything around you is nothing but a pressure of debt because you're living way beyond your means, and there is no, even in the areas where government could be alleviating some of those tensions, it is not. And you are not putting two and two together. And some of these people are doctors and lawyers and engineers and architects.
Yeah.
And you start to say, how are we going to navigate out of that massive brainwashing job that they've done to people to look at anything that has to do with an active government that is responding to the Commonwealth. Right, and implementing regulations, it is really an incredible victory. Well, just like the plastic industry,
right?
Succeeded in selling us out to plastics, and now we're paying the price for it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like these are like brilliant, mass manipulation, strategic, propaganda.
Well, see, but you made a point a second ago though, where people's heads are so far up their ass, and that's not exactly a clinical term, but it's true though, because I've got friends that you would never know are wealthy because they got a 14-year-old car, right? They just keep it going. They don't need a car. This runs. AC works. I'm fine, right? And meanwhile, they sock away cash. They make investments. They buy property. You look at the guy, you look at the lady, you would never know because they don't do this conspicuous consumption. They don't make $400,000 a year and spend $415.
Right.
That's what we do in this country.
Yeah.
And then voting against our own interests. Almost, you said it a second ago, almost all the red states that, think all this stuff that we're talking about is communist, they're on Medicare, they get some form of assistance, they're on unemployment. I can promise you a town like Anderson, Indiana that got wiped out when GM left. I can promise you most of those people are probably very, very conservative.
Yep.
And they're probably on some form of assistance or other or combination. And they will tell you to your face that they are not those people that accept assistance. Yeah. Oh, well, we're not like those people. We're not lazy. Our jobs just went away. Well, who are those people? We just had 15,000 more jobs evaporate because of GM, right? So so who are those people? Right, but then it gets into kind of a bad little segue. But then it gets into how we look at war, for example. Like what we're doing in Syria. Right, we sell that war here as a humanitarian effort, and we like to ignore that we're probably the number one purveyor of terror in the world and have been for about 60, 70 years now.
Yeah, well, luckily at least Trump has begun to lift the lid off of that. He's basically now pretty much, especially in his last speech. that he gave, yesterday or Christmas Day or whenever he went to Iraq. I mean, he basically said, if we want protection money. You know what I mean? In other words, it's like
not before giving away the SEAL Team 6 or the Navy SEALs operation on accident. He gave. I guess he inadvertently gave away some base information while he was talking.
Yeah, I mean, but ultimately, though, I mean, he's lifting in his arrogance.
Sure.
He has lifted the lid, and there are still people refusing to acknowledge what he's saying to their face. In other words, he basically said, in no uncertain terms, we don't care what the Saudis did to that journalist. We don't give a shit. Which is how the United States has always functioned.
Absolutely.
We have never given a shit about anything other than how to protect. I mean, every single intervention in Central America and Latin America 100%. to the point of fabricating nations like Panama, which Panama was never a country. No. We fabricated the whole thing, stole it from Colombia so we could control the canal.
That's right.
And you talk about Honduras. In other words, at least you have to give it to this guy. He's like, look, if you guys want protection, it's like the Mafia. He's a gangster, man.
Yeah.
And he's a gangster, and he's basically saying, he's never said, we're leaving Syria because,
we're taking troops out, but we're going to keep bombing them, by the way.
We're going to keep bombing them, which is basically, he's doing the typical, real estate magnate cost benefit analysis.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So basically, there is just too much money. We don't need to spend that much money.
Right.
We can have, the Turkish government kind of depends on our support and our protection, no matter what it is that we are putting out there, just, to give them a little bit of a wake-up call. You guys finish the job.
Right.
You finish the job, and we'll kind of let you do what you're doing, right? And then we will still, in other words, it's a racket. And he's lifting the lid off of it, and I don't know how anybody could not. I mean, there is no reading in between the lines, right? There is no confusion about the language, and still, there is just this denial, which I believe, I don't know. I mean, are Americans like still walking around convinced that somehow, we are just the good guys that are being taken advantage of? We just need to just make sure that NATO, as if NATO controls,
as if NATO's necessary,
right? I mean, as if NATO's not there to do our bidding,
right?
And it's the other. What?
Why does Mauritania need to be in NATO? It's a country the size of Glendale, California. Why does it?
You mean Macedonia?
There's another Macedonia, Mauritania. I mean, and Bush promised Gorbachev that we would stop when we were in 88. The 88 NATO alliance was going to stop.
Oh yeah.
And now we're right up at Russia's ass. And again, perspective. We wonder why the Russians behave the way they do, why the North Koreans behave the way they do.
Right.
Because they've seen us as bad actors.
Yeah. And we're you were making the segue to Syria. The facts about what happened in Syria. But the problem is that everything is convoluted. Assad is Satan. In other words, it's the whole idea that they've been able to sell this notion that once we deem a government unacceptable, or once we decide that a certain government lacks whatever legitimacy we think it should have, regardless of whether it has legitimacy or not,
whether it's elected, whether it's a duly elected government or not,
it's okay to just go ahead and nobody blinks an eye.
Nope.
And neither the liberal sort of status quo or the conservative status quo blinks an eye. Now you have the isolationists in the right, and the libertarians making rumbling noises about non-intervention and isolation,
which I agree with.
But the problem is like it's not real and it's not authentic.
You mean on their part?
Yes,
Okay.
it's a front,
Okay.
right? Because in order to do that, they would have to actually take the analysis to the next level and realize that like they cannot have isolation and withdraw U.S. military action and still keep promoting U.S. economic hegemony.
Well, see, that's the difference between me and them.
Right.
Okay, I believe in all of that. I believe in retreating from U.S. economic hegemony.
Right.
And in true capitalist fashion, you make a product that people want to buy, and then they'll buy it. I don't need to go. You make a deal with the Nicaraguans, for example. You make a deal with Chile for their copper. And I don't need to steal their copper. Maybe Anaconda Copper isn't making as much money as they would have made before they kill Allende, but they still make a profit. And Chile is a functioning society without Pinochet, right? We don't do that. Like you said, it's an illusion because the libertarians do hang on to this notion of isolationism, but then they want to keep 1,200 fucking bases, occupy 80% of the world.
Yeah.
With 2 million troops.
No. They don't want to talk about economic inequality.
Right.
Either at home or abroad.
Right.
And you cannot talk about
It's a fairy story.
Right, exactly.
I agree with you.
So it's this whole idea that, the promotion of civil liberties and non-governmental intervention, but we're not going to necessarily talk. I mean, what are we talking about? So basically, to me, like you cannot talk about the dismantling of the state in any shape, form, or fashion until you start to talk about the dismantling of capital. And the dismantling of financial institutions that are keeping, our working class people, by the balls.
Well, and to throw out a number, give you an example on the banking. And just as a side note, so we bailed out the banks in 2008, about $1 trillion. We still subsidize them to the tune of $83 billion a year. We gave them zero interest. They got to pay it back. Are they ever? $26 trillion at zero interest that they could loan back to us on 18% credit cards and 4% home loans or whatever, right? This is what I'm saying. We should nationalize them. And then you control the capital. Because right now we don't produce anything, and when the so-called middle class will sit there and go, well, that's illegal. You're taking a business. Jamie Dimon is a fucking employee, right?
Yeah.
Lloyd Blankfein is a fucking employee,
right.
Who have failed. When employees fail, they get fired. they get fired. You made a shitty decision. You cost the company a lot of money. That Lloyd's of London kid that bet the farm and destroyed Lloyd's of London overnight.
Yeah,
got fired. Still no job in banking. I think he's selling coffee at Starbucks in like Heathrow now. But all that to say that's the kind of mistakes we don't make these people pay for. Syria, all of our interventions. Libya. I heard Obama say something about a year ago. Oh, yeah, well, I regret that. The fuck you regret that? How many hundreds of thousands of people were murdered?
He was regretting shit before he even left
office.
But they all regret it. They all do that.
It's like thoughts and prayers when a school gets shot up. I don't give a fuck. I want to see, honest to God, dude, I want to see war criminals prosecuted. You can't just have a little bit of democracy. You can't just have a little bit of human rights. Right. If you're going to sit there and cry me a river about Nicaragua or Honduras.
But only the victors get to have tribunals of the the defeated. Right. And we're not going to be able to have you start to, if we were to make a list of how many people who are now running around, not just, loose, but who are still viewed and
John Bolton
and worshipped and Kissinger and you name them, the Bush
family. Bush clan,
the Clintons and this latest crook and his whole family. Yeah. And that's just in government. You start to go into the private sector. You know what I mean? And some of those CEOs needed to be like tarred and feathered and humiliated in a public square.
100%.
And instead we bailed them out. They kept their jobs, everything you're saying. So until the power relation shifts, the only people that we're going to see tried at the, international tribunal in The Hague are going to be the defeated, the Serbs and,
See, but this is where
Gaddafi's children, whoever it is that has, that's it, man, so how do we shift that? And that's the question that we need to keep going back to. We need to keep talking to people. We need to start actually figuring out how to build a solvent people's party, in my opinion.
Sure.
It started by a people's movement.
Right.
And making sure that we do not, succumb to what happened in Europe, which gave birth to fascism, and which is happening in Europe again, and it's happening here.
Right.
So in that context, we have to step up our rhetoric in some way, but it has to be backed by organizing away from what the liberals are not going to cut it.
No.
Because the liberals don't have what it takes to speak truth to power because they are part of the problem, and they're never going to be part of the solution.
Well, see, but you made a point a second ago, though, and you made a point of the rhetoric has to get stepped up. I think the rhetoric has to come to earth. I think that one of the things that the liberals did, because they were becoming more and more effete and weaker, and so what they did was they came up with something they could control. Here's political correctness. Right. That's a narrative they could control. Multiculturalism, right? Yeah. Obama was a fucking brand. He was the United Colors of Benetton.
Yeah.
I tell Republicans all the time, I go, why did you hate Obama? He was the black Reagan. Oh, he was black. I'm sorry. And they get mad at me. Well, I'm not like that. Yeah, you are. Because he did all the shit y'all wanted to do under Bush, and you didn't. And he came in and did it, and now you're mad at him. We're going to stand in his way. Why? He's doing everything you want him to do. Right. He's Reagan. And so it's like I don't get, if you don't have social and economic justice, you don't have anything.
Right.
So I don't give a fuck if I've got a United Colors of Benetton working at Taco Bell or Starbucks.
Right.
You have to have social and economic justice.
Right. But in order to have that dialogue, we have to and this is something that Sanders did effectively, which even the Green Party was too timid to do, which is to actually say, you know what? You want to call me a socialist? Call me a socialist.
Right.
And to everyone's surprise, millions of Americans
responded.
We're okay with it.
Yeah.
Because you have to explain it to people.
He did.
And he explained it.
Yeah.
Now, is Bernie Sanders a socialist? No. Otherwise he would not be running for the Democratic Party.
Right.
And he would not have endorsed, a warmongering, corporates like Hillary Clinton when she threw him under the bus and so the fact is that raises questions about where his own legitimacy. 100%. On the other hand, I do believe that we have to keep working at educating people as to what these ideologies constitute. Mm-hmm. Because if we make a full circle, the ambiguity of ideals is not conducive to effective transformation. You have to, in other words, you have to create boxes that people can navigate.
Right.
You cannot just create 100 million grievances with 100 million solutions, because then you're creating 100 million ways by which you can get co-opted, which is what we were talking about what's going on in France.
Right.
You gotta have a decisive ideology that says we are for the protection of economic and social justice, the advancement of the rights of the working class. We are for regulating financial institutions. We are for the promotion and advancement of public institutions and the public sector.
Right.
And we are for a government that is going to work accordingly to these mandates. And these are the policies that we collectively demand.
Right.
And we organize those under a party, under a political structure. Otherwise, I don't particularly see how you can reach an effective transformation, right? I mean, I don't see it, Abe. In other words, it's like there's never going to be enough mass movements that can be organized out of the sort of chaos and desperation that global capitalism is producing under the present systems, that will translate
Right.
into an effective transformation of institutional change.
Right.
In order to do that, you have to get organized. Now, I'm not quite sure. We in this country are in a crisis, in a serious crisis. There is no left.
No, there's not. We have one party.
No, right.
The business party.
Right.
We have the business party.
And the problem is that the Green Party itself, which would, for all intents and purposes, should, for all intents and purposes, serve as the vehicle, has failed for whatever reason.
There's a lot of reasons. We know what those reasons.
We know what. That's a whole different program.
Yeah.
But. And so, what is the alternative?
Right.
How is there going to be the sort of necessary? Because a political party is not merely an electoral force.
Mm-hmm.
And a political party is exactly what can actually keep a movement like the Yellow Vest movement functioning as an organized entity that has a shared collective strategy that will not be co-opted, with one of two corrections here and corrections there, and all of a sudden you go from 10,000 people to 500 people in the streets, which is what happens, every single time.
Right.
So, I mean, right now we have to keep challenging ourselves for how to create, and call it what we will.
Right.
It cannot be a libertarian party.
Right.
Okay. The ultimate reality is that a lot of the things that we're talking about have historically fallen under what is called socialism.
Right.
And so people need to actually, on their own, and it doesn't have to be called that, but it's better to recognize it for what it is.
Right.
Because we cannot just navigate in a historical political vacuum.
Right.
As if there is no, 200 years of history. As if the 40-hour week came out of nowhere.
But see,
where
again,
did all these things come from?
Again, demand. It came out of demand. And and that's what we haven't been doing for a while. And on that note, we gotta start wrapping up.
Here we go. All right.
It goes by fast, right? Every time. Well, I don't know if we have enough time. We'll have enough time.
Yeah, and we never got to the new knowledge thing, man.
You know what? And that's why God is good, or Ralph the Head of Lettuce, because we can get another show out of it.
That sounds great.
Guys, my guest has been Adrian Boutureira. And again, patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. If you want to become a bitter pill, you can also listen to us for free on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, all of the usual suspects. We're also on Podcast Addict, which is a very convenient app to get all your podcasts. And again, guys, if this makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to, so sleep tight.
All right.